Hi, I'm David Andersen. I'm here to talk about a reader's guide to the stories in the diaries during lockdown. It's sort of like I'm the first draft author, and so basically I'm going to be telling you what I was thinking about and how I went about drafting these stories. Um, I want to talk to you a little bit about motivations for the project, and then I'll review some of the technical format issues that we've decided on for each diary entry. That leads into a discussion that each entry is in some sort of an idealized structure, and I'll give you one or two examples about that. And I'll talk about a sample of some of the lessons that were coming from the project. And what I'd like to do is end with some sort of meta reflections on the lessons that we hope to be getting from this project. There are two motivations, or maybe we could say inspirations, for these diaries. The first is Dana Meadows. Dana Meadows is one of the authors of the famous book Limits to Growth. She was also author of the syndicated newspaper column called The Global Citizen. She wrote 700 of these 800-word essays that were widely distributed around the world, actually talking about living a sustainable life. And she is a part of an inspiration for this series. The other is Garrison Keillor. Garrison Keillor is the comic host of the Prairie Home Companion. He has created this fictitious place, Lake Woebegone, and I've had the feeling over the years that the more he goes to Lake Woebegone, the better I get to know it and the characters in it. And in some sense, we have been inspired in this project to create this mythical place called New Fadum Farm, from which these lessons about COVID-19 originate. Some general features. We're trying to limit each essay to 800 words. I am a very long-winded person. All of my initial attempts failed. If you read the essays, you can see that I cut them off and I said this little thing, dig deeper to learn more lessons. That just means that I couldn't limit myself to 800 words. Another feature is that we try to keep as many of these entries as possible clearly focused on Ali's model. So when you go to the website, every one of these entries has an ability to download Ali's model. You have to have a copy of NSYM to do it. And there's copies of 3 PowerPoint shows that give a very solid, scientifically based briefing on what's in the model, and you'll hear Ali himself will give you these 3 briefings later on. Another feature, technical feature, is each story has a title. This one is called Converting the Egg Club to a COVID-Safe Trusted Network, so it's about trusted networks. It starts with a trailer that talks about a specific incident, has a neat little picture, and then the story formally ends. Most stories end with a formal lesson, so I'll talk about this a little bit more, but that's the general structure of each story. Some of the stories have this little feature called read more to dig deeper, and that's where I stick in stuff because I couldn't keep it down to 800 words. Here's an example of some dig deeper things that has not yet passed Dan's review. It's the only story that has any model output in it, so I had to show it. It's showing the relative, that red line is a relative outbreak of COVID-19 patients in Tehran as the second wave starts. There's a big deal in these models about second wave. And I think what's interesting is the second wave in a population of 80 million people starts with under 100 people. And I could find no better way to say that in this story than by actually showing it in the simulation, because it's important that in terms of a policy response, we respond early once the first wave gets put under control. More about that later. Each story seeks to tie back to some other story on New Fadum Farm, and one of the key features in the model is how once we get past the first wave, as we're approaching the second wave, the pandemic is reduced in scale. I just showed you that feature where in all of Iran, there's only 100 cases coming online. And that's really important. So I was trying to think, well, what's a story on our farm where something that's big and raging and out of control starts very small. And my wife reminded me of this story where there's a train that runs right by the new Fadum Farm, and in the fall, there's sometimes embers that spark out of the train, and everybody knows what to do about it. They show up with a rake and you beat out those little embers. And the fire department sometimes show up and they issue these little water tanks and these little tiny fires that are put out everywhere. And everybody knows how to do that, and fires never get out of control. One time they did get out of control, it almost burned down our barn. I mean, I think of COVID as that way. We have these little outbreaks all the time now in Albany County. We have the public service, which is on top of it, is putting them out all the time. And that's how we have to stay safe, by having this. Our public health department is our fire department, constantly putting out these little fires. And that's how we're staying safe in Albany County. And I thought that was a neat little story for talking about the global policies for controlling the pandemic. So each story seeks to tie back to some little story like that on New Fadum Farm. There is an idealized structure for each story. It presents an incident. We try to talk about that incident using Ali's model. We reflect back on the incident and then try to draw a more general lesson. Let me give you an example of that. There was a story called How to Stop a Pandemic. The incident was that David and Deborah ran out of ice cream, and we had to go down to our local convenience store to buy some ice cream, and we put on our masks. This was at the beginning of the pandemic. It's back in April, and we were feeling kind of awkward. And David said, "Wow, do we really have to put these masks on?" And then he rolls out, it's not actually Ali's model. He has a simplified version of Ali's model. We call it Babek's model. And it's the only mathematical treatise. We've got this little mathematical treatise that looks at the mathematical conditions for stopping a pandemic. And it says, holy moly, this is an explosive thing. It's only going to stop when we have herd immunity. If we don't have herd immunity, we have to do things like wear masks and social distance. And there's a little like mathematical proof of that. So that's how the story goes. Starts with an incident, dives into the model, comes back out and says, we're heroes when we wear our masks. So that's how a story's meant to work. And then that story, here's the general lesson that comes from it. We have this lesson has two lessons. It talks about, the three ways that you can stop a pandemic. You can read it, but this intends to be a generalized summary of what the story was about, and then it talks about what this means in terms of policy. So these were lessons that we were writing in early to mid April. So here's another story. A very important lesson in the model is the notion that about the second wave. Unfortunately, the second wave is currently exploding in Tehran. Unfortunate, because that's what Ali's model predicted, and that's what's happening. So the story starts with a little trailer, plans to rent a tent, hire a DJ and a caterer, and then hold a party to celebrate getting through the COVID-19 are put on hold for a while. So the storyline is we're planning on having a party at the end of the summer to celebrate the end of COVID, because everybody was talking about at that time in April, this whole thing's going to be over by June. So we go into dives into the model a little bit and says, hey, wait a second, it's probably not going to be over by June. In fact, there's probably going to be a second wave. Watch out. There's a little diversion in there that talks about mental models, and it says my mental model, having looked at Ali's formal model, is that there's going to be a second wave, that it's going to be around for 3 years. We got to get used to this. And that's what we were saying back in April when this thing was just starting up in New York. Another kind of example that isn't really model based, it starts about Florence Nightingale. David and Deborah Andersen have been watching a Netflix series, Victoria, and we encountered Florence Nightingale. And I love Florence Nightingale. People think of her as the founding of nursing, but actually she was a statistician. And the lesson there is that data-based analysis and models have always been the best way to design scientifically grounded strategies. we need a strong and respected partnership between scientific knowledge and political will to get our society safely to the other side of this pandemic. That was a polemic calling for political leaders to listen to the epidemiologists. So that's not really model-based. We got off on this little polemic there. I'd like to end this discussion by talking about three meta lessons that have emerged from this work, and we want to talk about. They all arise from the observation that we are actors who live out our lives in the pandemic as it threatens, grows, recedes, and then repeats itself. And these lessons have to do with states of mind or ways of being that help us deal with the pandemic. They have to do with the nature of our mental models. They have to do with being able to think globally and act locally, and our attitudes towards data. I'd like to say a little bit more about each one of these three aspects of these meta lessons on the next couple of slides. So, to act locally, you have to have a global context. Hopefully, these lessons help us understand the dynamic of the pandemic. It's a global dynamic. Globally, we have to understand the situations that we face in our local actions is not just the pandemic, but it's the pandemic mediated by the actions of the public health service. Throughout these lessons, we're saying you've got to have a strong and active public health service, or you're going to be in trouble. Local actions are informed by these global understandings, but it's like, how can I influence my organizations? What do I need to know about opening schools in my church, my workplace? And how can I structure my own behavior? And these lessons are moving in. How can I set up trusted networks that I can remain hospitable to my friends? How do I create living bubbles that are linked together to allow me to interact with close family members? And we're also talking about personal behaviors locally. And I think we're trying to reflect in these things about ethical, moral, and some would say theological implications of these stories. The third meta lesson has to do with data. Data is sort of the opposite of rumor, fear, and anxiety. It's how we conceptualize model. It's how we calibrate and build confidence in models. But the key point here is that you've got to keep your eye on the data, on the local data, on what's going on in your town to act safely. So if it's not safe, data tells you if you're not safe. If it is safe, data tells you that you are safe. So you avoid reckless behavior by doing things that you shouldn't, and it makes you less anxious. Finally, the third thing has to do with mental models. It's the observation that no one bases their lives on mathematical models, but it's how we think about the world. And what system models are good for is that they allow us to align our mental models with a deeper understanding of how the systems that we live in work. And our mental models also allow us to interact with our institutions, our schools, our churches, and our workplaces. And finally, one of the themes in these stories is that COVID-19 presents strong value-based moral and ethical challenges. We believe that how you respond to the pandemic is a moral choice as well as a scientific and biological choice. And unfortunately, these issues have become politicized in the United States, and we're trying to give a little pushback against that. The way I look at it is where I think these stories are coming out is in terms of protocols, trying to have little guidelines for action that are help to frame our mental models, our data-based, and give us guidance on how to act locally. I think that's where we're going with this thing. There are three examples. There are examples of protocols. The first one was in the story called Finishing Deborah's Wool Room. It was the first time it occurred to me that we're having some builders come on site, and we needed to have protocols to keep everyone living on the farm safe. There's a couple of stories in there about the egg club. We had too many eggs during the pandemic, and we're giving them away to our friends, and we're trying to figure out ways to structure social interaction with close friends and relatives. There's a story which is still under review. I hope Dan will release it for publication soon, called The Horseshoe Tournament in the Old Pear Orchard. And that is an attempt to generalize the protocol for meeting friends for small gatherings to having larger gatherings. The idea being that having a couple of people over for a horseshoe tournament can be done safely. I think that's what we're trying to demonstrate with that protocol. And it's a more complicated protocol than just sitting down with some friends and having a cup of coffee and exchanging a dozen of eggs. So that's where I see all of this going. Thank you.